I want to talk about characterization in literature today. All the ways we get to know the characters in what we're reading. And characterization is the way in which an author presents, describes, and portrays any character or characters. I like talking about characters, thinking about characters, because they're often our windows into the story. I don't know if you've ever found that, you've been reading a book and you're finished and you kind of hate to read those last few pages because you want to know what happens next. You want to stay with that character. You want to find out what happens to that character. You kind of feel a little bereft without that character in your life anymore. That's really effective characterization on the part of the author. So that effective characterization in effect allows us to empathize with or relate to that character or those characters. Makes us feel like we can empathize or understand. When we empathize with literary characters, we place ourselves in their situation to a certain extent, which permits us to kind of live the story vicariously. Maybe you've felt that sometimes. We kind of begin to feel what's happening to them in our own selves. Again, that's very effective characterization. But characters do more than just make us feel good or make us feel part of the story or kind of put us into the story. They move the plot forward. When one character steals something from another one, that means that there must be some reaction to that action. So the actions of the characters actually help move the plot forward, and the sequence of events follow the actions of the character. But characters also help to reveal theme, which is the author's comment on being human, or life, or the world around us. So you need to consider how characters change or develop or don't do either of those things, because that helps us shed light on what the author is saying about, it helps us shed light on what the author is saying about life. There it is. So a character is effectively drawn if he or she is as multifaceted and complex as you and I are. Which is why Dory, even though she's a very flat character physically and a cartoon to boot, still has some kind of depth to her, doesn't she? She's not quite as ditzy as, of course I'm referring to the classic Finding Nemo. She's not quite as ditzy as we first think of her as. We discover that she could be a good friend, that even though she may not be the brightest tool in the shelf, she can speak whale, for crying out loud. She can remember an address. So, she's got a little bit more going on to her than we first realized. And I think that's what makes her such a winning character. And it's the continued process of getting to know the character, discovering new facets of her personality or understanding his reaction to events that keeps us interested in the story, right? If the character is really clearly drawn and richly drawn, then we're interested in how this character reacts. We're interested in how this character moves through life. So effective characterization happens when we are convinced that the actions are motivated, and then the characterization is believable. So if we see someone like this Batman character shopping, we're not going to believe that, right? Because Batman is a larger-than-life character. He's not going to go out schlepping his produce down the street, right? He's got Alfred to do that. He's a superhero. Superheroes don't shop. And I recognize this is a bit goofy because it's a big man in a Batman costume. But again, within the genre of superhero fiction, there's no shopping. There's no standing in line at the bank, because these would not be believable actions. Superheroes are above that. Also, John Wayne, he never really acted in parts that were less than alpha male kind of characters, right? And we believed him in it because he had the persona, he had the script, he had the diction to be able to carry those things off. It's probably why his character, or his stage name was John Wayne and not Marion Morrison, which was his actual name, because that's not a very manly name, is it? So the characterization has to be complete in order for us to go along with it. How do we discover characterization? Well, we can discover it through direct presentation, where the author, narrator, or other characters, where the narrator or other characters describe how that character is, or indirect presentation, where the actions and words of a character help us understand who that character is. So let me give you an example from Charles Dickens' Hard Times, which you'll find in chapter 4 of your text. Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else, and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoned animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to the facts, sir. The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of the schoolroom, and the speaker's square forefinger emphasized his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line on the schoolmaster's sleeve. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's square wall of a forehead, which had his eyebrows for its base, while his eyes found commodious cellarage in two dark caves, overshadowed by the wall. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's mouth, which was wide, thin, and hard-set. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's voice, which was inflexible, dry, dictatorial. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's hair, which bristled on the outskirts of his bald head, a plantation of furs to keep the wind from its shining surface, all covered with knobs, like the crust of a plum pie, as if the head had scarcely warehouse room for the hard facts stored inside. The speaker's obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, made his very neckcloth trained to take him by the throat, and an unaccommodating grasp, like this, a stubborn fact as it was, all helped the emphasis. Okay, so this character is called Mr. Gradgrind. Does he sound like a soft, feeling, gentle kind of man? This is a picture of him from an old Victorian image. You know, Dickens is leaving nothing to the reader's imagination, right? His voice is inflexible. His mouth is described as hard. His head is, his hair bristles on his bald head. You know, so all of these characterizations help us see Mr. Gradgrind as a hard character, right? So Dickens is telling us exactly what to think about him. And he does it really colorfully. But by contrast, indirect characterization is more popularly used in recent day authors because showing what the reader or what the character is like as opposed to telling what the character is like allows the reader then to discover the meanings. The reader to kind of draw his or her own conclusions about what that character is like. And part of the reason is, you know, our world has changed and we no longer sort of live in societies that follow the same kind of values and fixed meanings in life the way people did in Dickens's time, where he could make a statement about a character and everyone would kind of go, Now we might go, oh, that's a bit stereotypic, isn't it? Right? So now authors tend to let readers make up their own mind about how that character is. So the author then avoids telling the character how to think about, telling the reader how to think about the character. But the reader then has to rely on the actions and the words of the character in order to surmise what is the nature of that character. And we see that in The Sorrowful Woman, don't we? With the woman who Godwin never really tells us whether we should feel sympathy for her, whether we shouldn't feel sympathy for her, whether she's a good person. I mean, all we get are sort of what she does, how she acts, a few things that she says. So we have to infer the characterization on our own, which I think is a little more fun. So how can we actually analyze a character? In what ways can we see what a character is like? Well, you can pay attention to what she says. You know, when Godwin says, let me flip to it quickly. Bear with me here. When she says on page 40, "I'm the luckiest woman," she said, crying real tears. Well, that should tell us something. Even though the title is A Sorrowful Woman, she's a lucky woman. By how he says it. By how is implying the tone of the character's voice. So the attitude behind what that character is saying. What does the character really mean? And we should sort of cast our magnifying glass to the husband in A Sorrowful Woman when, he's so understanding. He's so understanding. Godwin, again, doesn't give us a lot of information, but she does repeat that word understanding a lot. By psychological description, which is kind of what the character believes, or what the character's preferences are, or that character's oddities. Believe me, we're going to run into some odd characters where we can do some pretty developed psychological description. It's things like, I hate goats because my father was hit by a goat. Or, I detest milk. I refuse to drink milk in anything. Right? Those kinds of preferences or likes or dislikes, or even attitudes that have come through traumatic events. Physical description can also help us understand about a character. We sure saw that with Mr. Gradgrind, but we also see it with characters like Darth Vader. Right? That's a pretty ominous looking guy right there. Same with Mary Poppins. She looks like she's going to pop in and fix things, doesn't she? She's got such a good upright and just so manner about her. And speaking of Mary Poppins, the name is also another thing to consider. You know, authors can name their characters absolutely anything. So when an author, Mary Travers, names her character Mary Poppins, what does that tell us? Well, Mary is it's got a nice connotation, right? Because it kind of means happy, but it also could be symbolic of Jesus' mother, sort of a spiritual mother of us all. And Poppins is fun, but is kind of efficient, and you can imagine she pops in. The same with Darth Vader. Look at his name. You know, Darth sounds a little bit like death, and Vader sounds a little bit like invading. And both of those connotations can be attached to that character. So pay attention to what the author is choosing to call his or her character. And note, too, that we don't get a name at all in A Sorrowful Woman. Pay attention to what the character does. The character's actions can be really telling about what motivates that character. By what others say about him or her. About his or her environment. We saw that in the story of an hour, didn't we? Where we looked at Mrs. Mallard, who was peering out on springtime. What does that mean? And the corollary, of course, is the sorrowful woman, who has the same kind of images that she looks out on toward the end of the story. It's also springtime, but it's a little bit different. What do we make of that? By reactions to others. How does this character react to others? How does this mother react to her son? That's so unusual. Why does she do it that way? What does that tell us about her? Or by his reaction to himself. How does that sorrowful woman feel about herself? Can we surmise that, reading between the lines and reading carefully, using our close reading skills to figure that out? That'll help us figure out what kind of character she really is. So there are different kinds of characters we need to be able to identify and discuss, like the protagonist, who is the main character, and who may not necessarily be good or heroic. And I think we can agree that the sorrowful woman probably doesn't fall into one of those classically good characters, does she? She's a little more complicated than that. The antagonist, then, is the force against which the protagonist struggles. It may actually not be human, and may even be an aspect of the protagonist. You know, if the protagonist is struggling internally, that's said to be a human versus self conflict. Well, then it's that aspect of the character that the protagonist is struggling against that is the antagonist. So it's whatever force that protagonist is struggling against. A foil, then, is a secondary character who contrasts the protagonist, thus helping to define that character even more. So we do find a foil in the sorrowful woman because there's usually some qualities that are similar to the two characters that help us recognize that this is a foil. So the only other woman character in a sorrowful woman is the girl, the young woman. So how does her efficiency and perfection at the job of mothering and taking care of the man and the boy help us understand more about the woman? Because she's doing those jobs that the woman is not doing, Godwin is really saying to us, you know, pay attention here. This is a foil, and that foil it comes from the old jeweler practice to use a piece of foil or tin, and then they would place their jewel on top of the foil in order for the light to pick up the jewel more readily, to help the customer see the radiance and brilliance of the jewel more readily. That's where the term comes from. And that's what a foil does. It helps us to see another character more fully. Characters can be round, where they're fully developed and multifaceted, like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, where she starts out where she, you know, isn't just this Southern belle, you know, through the Civil War and the events that happen over that, 5.5-hour movie or whatever it is. We learn that she's quite strong, and she's quite resilient, and she's actually pretty brave, and she's actually got a head on her shoulders, and all these things that we really didn't know about her at first. She's nuanced and she's complex, as opposed to a flat character then, which is a one-dimensional or stereotypical character, kind of like the henpecked husband. You know, they're kind of found in those stereotypes, those tropes, the nosy neighbor, the dumb blonde. You won't find a lot of these in literature. We do find them in popular culture more, and not even in popular culture as much as we used to. Developing your dynamic characters are those that change over the length of the story. The dynamic nature of them implies movement, evolution, and that's what they do. It's somehow in the story, somehow through the plot, somehow through the events that happen, or other characters that work with these characters, they change. And how do they change? That change is often an insight into the author's theme or comments on being human. And we see that, of course, in Hamlet, probably the greatest character ever written, who starts off just desperately sad at the death of his father, but then becomes so full of revenge, but then his morality takes over, and it's that juxtaposition of the morality and the revenge that make it such a brilliant play. Static characters don't change at all. And their static characters are useful just to sort of have the other characters bounce off of. We may know one or two characteristics of that character, but really not much at all, and they don't change, like the evil stepmother in Cinderella. You know, we don't need to have her change. She's fine just the way she is, because it's against her that Cinderella bounces against. And there are other characters in literature that just don't change. So pay attention to the characters in literature and think about how they change. How are we getting to know them? What is the author saying about them? And just enjoy getting to know them.